Once again, good morning, everybody. My name is Andrew Hone, and I'm the President and CEO of the Portland Business Alliance, Greater Portland's Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for joining us today for our March Forum. Today's focus is on the unpredictable and building resilient business systems. Something we all have learned over this past year is critically important. Everyone here at the Alliance hopes you are well and enjoying these warmer days. Wishing everyone here a happy St. Patrick's Day as well. We're all Irish today. As we continue to wait on the rolling out of the COVID-19 vaccinations for everyone, we encourage all to please continue the important work of physical distancing. Let's all do our part to contain this virus by wearing our masks. With ongoing COVID-19 updates and new regulations, our teams continue to work diligently in serving as a resource for our community. Our website is updated frequently. You can follow us on social media for updates, and you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and elsewhere. There it is. A recording of this presentation and links for resources mentioned will be available on our website later today. Of course, none of these events could happen without the support of our members. We have some incredible sponsors today, and I would like to thank them. Thank you to our Forum Series sponsors, KeyBank and the Portland Tribune. Joining us today from KeyBank is a director of the Portland Business Alliance, Michelle Weisenbach. Welcome, Michelle.
Good morning. I'm Michelle Weisenbach, the president for KeyBank here in Oregon and Southwest Washington. And thank you very much for joining us today. The month of March has taken on a new meaning for each of us since last year. And while none of us have walked the same path, we have in so many ways all been on the same journey. This March, we're looking forward optimistically. I know I, for one, am looking forward to getting my shot, and yet it's important to take time to look back and see what lessons that we can take as we move forward. That's because as business leaders, we know the next crisis is right around the corner, although we all hope it is far less intense than this last one. It's our obligation as leaders to be prepared so we can support our clients, our teammates, our communities. And on that note, I have been particularly proud of the work that KeyBank has done during this challenging time. As a COVID swept the nation, our leaders here at Key quickly mobilized around our stated purpose, which is to help our clients and communities thrive. We initially focused on enacting our business resiliency plans to preserve our ability to operate and serve our many constituencies, and then put our second focus to supporting our teammates. And in that way, we're really positioned to lean in and find innovative ways to support our clients and communities during this time. We're really proud of the work that we've done in our service during this period. And I would really like to thank our KeyBank teammates that are on this webinar today, as well as any other members of the financial services industry, as we all leaned in a year ago about today to implement and guide businesses through the Paycheck Protection Program over this past year. As we look forward, there are always more ways to learn, which is why I am especially looking forward to our discussion today, learning about resilience in the face of crisis and what we should do today to help prepare ourselves for an unexpected tomorrow. Thank you as always to the Portland Business Alliance for your support of the vibrant business community we have here in Portland. Despite a year like no other, we have all pulled together, and I know these meetings have been an important touchstone for us all. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And our other sponsor of the day is the Portland Tribune. And Mark Garber has been a mainstay of this program for so long. He couldn't be with us this morning, but we are so grateful for the Trib's support. We encourage all of you to go out, subscribe, and support our local journalists and journalism to make sure that we all get the news that is so critical to being able to make the decisions that we all need to make. So thank you again to the Portland Tribune and for Dana Haynes today for being with us to help moderate this important conversation. So with that, I would also like to thank Portland State University for being an event sponsor for this month's forum, and you'll hear from them shortly. Thank you to all our incredible sponsors. And now I would like to introduce the board chair for the Portland Business Alliance, Mike Golib, President of Business with the Portland Timbers and Thorns. Welcome, Mike.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy lives to join us for our forums. Our members have found these forums to be incredibly useful. So thank you for being here for this very timely an important topic. Just a few ground rules to share with you before we jump in, and that is questions will only be asked and answered through the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen, but feel free to engage in ongoing dialogue in real time using the chat function. So we look forward to your comments and questions. And at this point, let me introduce our friend, Dr. Stephen Percy, the always well-dressed president of Portland State University. Dr. Percy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Portland Business Alliance, for this chance to be a partner with you today on this really important conversation. In addition to, like all of you, working so hard to respond to the pandemic, we've also been working to celebrate our 75th anniversary here at Portland State. We've been around for 75 years. Much of our history has been about resilience, including the fact that our very earliest version of our campus was actually destroyed by a flood just a few years after it was started. So I'd like to show you a brief video that just talks a little bit about Portland State and its history, just to remind us of where we've been over the past 75 years. Can we show that video, please?
We started from scratch, back from war, with nothing to lose. We fought to learn, to build the foundation of our future. But it was washed away. From the waters we rose, the college that wouldn't die. From the Oregon ship to the shores of Portland, we flooded the city to serve, to improve the lives of our families, our community, our city, our country. We are thirsty for more knowledge, for change, opportunities, justice. And when they don't listen, when they push back, we stand up to show the world how, to prove that we make a difference, and we will continue to learn, to fight for what we believe in.
Thanks for the opportunity of letting me share that with you. We at Portland State have been thinking about emergency management since about 2015, and we're compelled to look at that given the story in the New Yorker, the big one, many of you maybe remember, that reminded us of the impending risk of a major earthquake associated with the Cascadia subduction zone. And that led us to think about how we're prepared. And certainly Mother Nature has brought on other major issues for us to deal with that have a crisis and emergency proportions, including the major wildfires and recently the snow and ice storms. As we began to look at the field of emergency management and looked across the state, we found that there was very little professional and graduate education in this field. And so we took it upon ourselves to develop a really interdisciplinary cross-campus approach to looking at emergency management. And as we looked at this emerging field in our country, we began to realize that the notion of resilience is a prime component of that. People are moving much toward that. The natural tendency in a disaster is to figure out a response and do as much as you can, as quickly as you can, is to mitigate harm. And of course, that's very important. But the notion of resilience teaches us that you need to prepare for disaster and emergency. You need to be preparing also for how you could come back better so that the next time you're stronger. And so there's a lot of ways of thinking about that, but a lot of our program focuses on resilience, the human dimension, how we make sure that everyone in our community has an equal chance of getting the resources, that we don't have unanticipated inequities in that delivery. And so there is so much work to be done in this field of emergency management. And we at Portland State want to play a role in providing educational opportunities for that work. Could I have the slides, please, on a couple of our programs? I think we have some slides here that talk about our programs. Well, while I'm waiting for those to come up, I would just say that we've created at our graduate level, there we go, We have an emergency management and community resilience professional certificate. Professional certificate is a non-degree certificate, but it's designed specifically to provide the technical and applied knowledge that business, community, and government leaders need. In our work, we have come to understand in emergency management that if the business community cannot come back after a disaster, communities cannot heal, people will leave and will have major, major long-term consequences. So a vibrant business community that can be resilient and come back is very important. So we have a professional certificate. It begins on April 9th. It's 7 weeks long. There's one live on session each Friday, and there's a discount because of our strong partnership with the Portland Business Alliance. So you may go to that website if you happen to be interested. I encourage you, if you'd like to learn more on this professional, business-oriented approach to looking at emergency management and resilience, I'd encourage you to do so. Next slide, please. Just so you know, we also have a 2-day workshop available in early June on adapting your workforce to COVID-19. And we also have, as I mentioned, a full graduate certificate and a master's program. The master's program is a full master's length program. The certificate is a shorter version. These are, again, professional opportunities for people to engage who want to learn more because their job or part of their job or all their job or an emerging part of their company or organization is looking at emergency management. So that's a little bit of background on what we're doing. We're pleased to be here today, and we're so pleased to be part of what's a very important conversation for our community and our business community. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dana Haynes, who is the managing editor of the Pamplin Group.
Thank you very much, Dr. Percy, and good morning to all the attendees. I'm excited for this conversation and to introduce you to the rest of today's panel. So please welcome, we have Dr. Carlos Mena. He's the Nike Professor of Supply Chain Management with Portland State University. We have Bill Messner, Director of Wildfire Mitigation and Resilience with Portland General Electric. We have with us today Fred Scalera, Director of Public Safety Strategy for AT&T FirstNet Programs, and Dr. Stephen Percy, who also will be joining us for today's panel. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to try and keep answers to 2 minutes because we have a fantastic topic here and we'd like to stay in the time allotted. So first, let's start with brief introductions, and please share your role in emergency response and management. And Carlos, let's begin with you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Carlos Mena, I'm a professor at Portland State as part of the business school. The focus of my research is on risk and resilience. I've been doing this for a couple of decades, but the opportunity of COVID has really gave us an opportunity to research how companies have been impacted, how supply chains have been impacted, and more importantly, how they're responding to this pandemic. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Bill, do you want to kick us off next?
Yes, sure. Again, Bill Messner, the Director of Wildfire Mitigation and Resiliency for Portland General Electric. That role provides a strategy for wildfire preventions from our assets, but more importantly for today's discussion, I manage a group that prepares the company to respond to risks that interrupt normal operations. And that ranges from the pandemic, which we've already kind of mentioned already today, but it could be as simple as one of our assets or one of our buildings losing a main water break or supply, and we have to replace or displace our workers and find a new location for them to work.
Fred.
Yes, thank you, Dana. My name is Fred Scalera. I'm the Director of Public Safety Strategy with FirstNet, as well as I run the Response Operations Group, which handles all planned emergency and urgent events in all 50 states, 5 territories, and the District of Columbia. And we'll be talking about some of those action items as we move through the program today. Thank you.
And finally, Dr. Percy.
Hi there, welcome again. My major role was working with a group of faculty across schools and colleges at Portland State with many different disciplinary backgrounds to design a vibrant emergency management set of programs.
Excellent. All right, so for everybody, tell us the one important thing you learned over the course of the last 12 months, whether it be pandemic, wildfire, or even protest related. And Fred, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So I think pandemic was the largest change and largest amount of events over the past year and a half for us. Last January 28th was the first plane came into California with people that had COVID from out of the country. And we wound up standing up a site there. From there, we wound up working on over 4,700 events with FEMA and the Army of Army Corps of Engineers, and also how to respond differently, where they were setting up in rural areas where we really didn't have great connectivity and in-building solutions. Can't just stand up cell towers and portable SAC holds, how we responded with different solutions and handled that. And we're now back into that full range of how are we handling vaccination sites. So it's gone from, the isolation to then the testing and now to the vaccination sites. And I think that has been a great way we've grown and changed and modified the way we respond for things like that in the future, and actually built an emergency operations center across our company to deal with all the states at once, because they were all dealing with the same thing.
Excellent. Bill, same question to you.
Yes, thank you. I think for me, it's that emergencies are not convenient, nor do they come at the time that you want them to come out. But meaning that we have been in a pandemic for well over a year, and we have faced fundamental changes about how we all do our work, right? I mean, good example is this, right? We're doing a meeting that would historically been in person, and now we're doing it virtually. But just knowing that emergencies are dynamic, adjustments will need to be made, and you'll have plans, but you'll have to adjust them in real time. And for Portland General Electric, we're an essential service, and our customers need us now more than ever. People are working at home, kids are learning from home, et cetera. And we've had a plan, and we've been able to execute that. And the electrons are still flowing, even in the midst of a pandemic. Wildfires and ice storms have impacted us all, and it was devastating to our community, but we're able to maintain the grid, restore power as quickly as safety would allow us to do so. So, I mean, to me, it's always about, you got to be on your toes and being able to adjust.
Dr. Percy, take that question if you could from the academia standpoint.
Well, I think that one of the most important things we have got to learn is to do a better job of making sure that everyone has an equal response to equal capacity to come back from a pandemic. We have had disparities in many areas of our social and economic world that includes BIPOC communities, traditionally marginalized communities, and we have yet much to do to make sure that those who are disadvantaged have the same capacity to come back and be resilient as other people who may have more resources or capacity.
And since we're on a theme of letting knowledge serve the city, Carlos, take that one.
So for me, the biggest realization with the pandemic is that the education and the advice we've been given to businesses in particular has been biased. So for 20 years, I've been telling companies how to be more efficient, how to outsource, how to global source, how to cut inventories down. And all of these things have made the entire system more vulnerable to impact. So that's why I think we need to rebalance how we educate people around the theme of resilience. And that's we're offering a new portfolio, as President Percy explained earlier, to help build the capabilities and the knowledge that will allow people to become more resilient.
If 2020 has shown us anything, it's that it is to predict the unpredictable. Several of you are focused on this critical work. For those in the business community who are on the call today, what are the 3 top practices or things that businesses should have in place? And Carlos, let's stick with you if we could.
So I have 4 to offer, but I'll be quick. The first one is we need to build a culture of resilience. We need to allow people to be a little paranoid, because if you're going to respond quickly, you need to be alert, you need to be sensing what's happening in the environment, and you also need to be empowered to act when something happens, right? You cannot wait for the command and control system to tell you what to do. You need to be able to respond quickly. The second one is we need more collaboration. We need to be able to work with our customers, work with our suppliers, work with our competitors in order to address some of these issues that we're currently facing. We need to be more agile, more responsive, and that usually means working in smaller units, smaller teams that are empowered to act. And finally, I think we need a more systemic view. We need to understand in which system we are part of, what are the interdependencies, what happens if we go in a different direction, how do we affect our communities, how do we affect our people. So those are the four areas of opportunities that I can see.
Excellent. Dr. Percy, you want to take that one?
I agree with what my colleague just said. I think that a couple of things that are really be useful is to have businesses think about partnerships or networks of groups of people, groups of companies that might work together during a pandemic to try to figure out how to respond and share some responsibility or resources during this very difficult time. I think it's also useful to have the business sector provide some knowledge to the public sector or the people that are organizing responses so that we can begin to think together and be creative about how to respond. I know, for example, in some communities, the big concern after an earthquake where there's no power is where are you going to get cash to buy anything? What's the economy going to run on? Such people were talking about mobile ATMs that run on gas-powered engines that could do things. So how do we think about where the vulnerabilities are in maintaining business operations? And how do we find ways that we might be able to work collaboratively, either in the business sector or with public and private connections to try to build some more resilience in our systems?
Bill, take a shot at that one.
Absolutely. And I also agree with what the comments that were just presented, but I'm actually going to start like a little more fundamental. I think one needs to start with your employees, and it's making sure that they have their own safety plan, because their safety is first and foremost. Encouraging them to have a plan for themselves and their family or friends, meaning that do they have emergency food and water? Do they have a meeting place so they can contact and communicate that they're safe? And the reasoning for all of this is that when they are able to come back to work or come back to the university, you have to have them fully engaged. They cannot be distracted about worrying about their family or friends. Second is to have a plan. Third is to exercise that plan and be continuously willing to improve it. PGE does have some information on our webpage, and I can make sure that you get this later, but it provides some information about planning, outage kits, and protecting sensitive equipment. It also may be helpful.
I'll take the liberty of speaking for PBA, saying they would love to have that one. Please do that. Fred, take this one.
Sure, I'd like to say it has to three things. So you have to be learning at all times, you have to be pivoting, and you have to be agile to put this all together. And we had to do that quite often. For an example, when we first started on COVID and we had to go put some equipment in for our technology building, the first team, we have our own hazmat team, we sent them out originally to do the work because nobody knew what this COVID was back January, February last year, right? And then as we kept learning, we found that, okay, it's not like this. We can pivot to here and modify where we need to go. And we only need to have masks and gloves. And it wasn't this big tsunami that was going to affect us, right? Because everybody didn't know what it was and where it went. And then remember I talked about being agile for your whole corporation. So as we went into hurricanes, wildfires, and storms and responding out with vehicles, how were we protecting the workers that had to go out? We had to modify plans to make sure that now they were wearing an N95, they were their gloves on, we were self-distancing and things like that. So it's really about learning. It's about pivoting and being agile to make that work for yourself.
Excellent. This information is coming very fast, and I'd like to remind our audience that there's that Q&A function on your website. If you got a question, use that mechanism. This is really good information. So my next question then is, where should businesses start when thinking about creating a crisis plan? What resources are out there for large businesses and for small businesses, remember our audience, and for their employees? And Dr. Percy, would you take this one?
Sorry, my technology froze for a second. Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. I think there's a lot of different resources out there. I would direct people to FEMA, for example, which has a variety of resources from everything from helping children to helping local governments, but there are definitely some features on there for businesses which talk about the basic elements of your plan, what you need to have, resources that you should have on hand, different kind of planning strategies. So I recommend some FEMA strategies. I'd also recommend many local governments here have, all of our local governments have emergency management bureaus or agencies that also have resources and opportunities. I want to make sure people do that. Our local counties in our city but all have emergency management units that have some information about that. And the state also has some websites and some information. Part of it is when you think about it, trying to figure out what are the exact disasters that you might need to be dealing with. Well, now we've got a bunch in our portfolio of examples of things we need to do, but you probably want to be thinking about how you're going to deal with it with the possibility impact of an earthquake, which is different than the pandemic, where our power stayed up largely thanks to the hard work, and our internet systems worked and our technology worked to help us through. But that won't help at all if we have another system where we don't have any power. So I think it's there are a variety of different sources, and I think they're listing some in the Q&A for people to look up, in addition to some of the great individual projects and organizations, including people here today.
That's great. Bill, do you want to take a swing at that one?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Dr. Percy said. And I'd also just did a quick web search of just a checklist for emergency planning. And the one I found the most useful is actually from OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And again, I can get the link to you, but in that nice checklist, it develops and implement emergency action plan, so an EAP. And in it has things from general issues to consider, like evacuation policies and procedures. I mean, the emergency could be that simple, right? Just how do we get out of the building if there was a fire, to reporting emergencies, alerting employees, and training and drills. And then again, I think all of these plans, and I'm going to have this theme throughout today, which is I keep repeating myself, which is plan, 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 right? So as I mentioned earlier, employees have to have a plan, and then you actually have to know what's in that plan and then exercise it. In our case, we have our emergency plans, but some of the other things that we consider are like, what are your emergency roles in that plan, right? So what are you going to do if that emergency actually happens? So you want to train people on that. And then we also have your secondary work location. So again, your primary work location may not be available. Employees need to know ahead of time where to go. So again, those are just some of the things to consider, and then always do that annual outage drill, and then learn, do the tabletop, and adjust and improve. So just that continuous improvement wheel.
Very good. Fred?
So coming off Dr. Percy, because I was going to talk about FEMA, so he took a little bit of that from me. But FEMA, DHS, I want to say something about federal sites and other sites, right? Please go to qualified federal sites. And this should be part of your planning. Do not go to the Facepecs and the Twitter feeds, the Instagrams, and believe what you read there to run your business on. Please, and this is true because some do, right? Please go to these government sites, get the proper information, reach out to your local community. Then let's talk about a plan. So planning is important, and we need to keep modifying plans. If you write that plan today, in 6 months you better pull it out. In 6 months you better pull it out, and you better add things in that all of your employees or in your families have plans of where to call each other. How do the company or your parent, how do you check on each other? So planning has got to be, and I use the word agile a lot, has got to be very agile. And if you're going to create the book and put it on a shelf and say, okay, I have a plan, we're good, and you don't bring it out because if you haven't modified since COVID, something's wrong. If you haven't modified since some of the other things that have occurred across the country this year, your plan is already out of date. So it's making sure you can check on families, making sure that you have a way. There's programs called Yes, Okay, and others that, you can send an alert out. All your employees can check in. These are no cost free apps, but think about things out of the box. We also used to practice, for an example, and I'm going on long, but fire drills were the big thing in all the schools, right? And then in New Jersey, we had 2 fire drills a month, and I eventually had one change from a fire drill to a Homeland Security drill a month, because the two people using fire alarms to evacuate for a possible bomb effect was the worst thing you could do. An active shooter, pull a fire alarm, you're taking everybody out. So please look at your plans, think, go to federal sites, work with your local community. Thank you.
Carlos, why don't you take us home on this one?
So a couple of months before the pandemic, we conducted some research asking companies what they were doing in terms of risk and resilience. And it surprised us that about a third of companies didn't even have a plan. It just didn't exist in the company. Maybe there were pockets of people planning for their own risk that would affect them, but there was nothing holistic. And these were all relatively large companies. I suspect that rate is much higher for small and medium companies. Right? There's no holistic way of evaluating risk. So if companies don't have this, I think the first thing they need to do is get together a team and brainstorm. What are the possible risks that would affect them? That's called a risk register. It's just a list of what might affect you. And then go on evaluating what is the possible impact of those risks and how likely they are to happen. I mean, there's some events like the pandemic, which are incredibly unlikely, but when they happen, they hit us really hard. And they need to be dealt with in a very different way to, hey, our shipment didn't arrive on time. Those are much more common risks, but the impact is very small. So you need to deal with them in very different ways. And for each one of those risks, you need to have a mitigation plan. And just going on threads, the next thing is you need to continuously evaluate those risks. So you cannot just leave them there and say, I've done my risk work. You need to meet every month and say, has anything changed? Are there any new emerging risks that might affect us? Have the probability of them happening changed? Has the impact of them happening changed? So it needs to become part of the culture, as I said earlier. You need to have this culture of, hey, something could hit us at any point. We need to be ready for it.
Excellent, excellent advice. Things can hit you simultaneously, like as randomly a pandemic, a wildfire, and a recession.
Correct, as we found out.
Yeah. So we're talking about resilience. We've been using that word a lot, resilience. So question here is, how can a business become resilient before a crisis or even after a crisis? What is the first thing businesses and people should do if the unpredictable happens and they're not prepared? Bill, why don't you start us on this one?
Well, so for me, it's the word of the day. I think every speaker has said is the word plan, right? So if that event happens and you don't have a plan, I think you have a big problem. And it is really hard to develop a plan when you're in the middle of a crisis. So it is imperative, and I think we've talked about a lot of great tools here, but I just think even starting that basis of a plan, a foundational something is where you need to start. And I don't think any of us will have every crisis that we could imagine. So to think of, 5 years ago, I don't think any of us would thought a pandemic would have caused what it has caused to us in our world today. But the point being is that you'll have your foundational tools, and if you have that started, you're in great shape. If you don't have it, your recovery will absolutely be delayed. And I think your most important resource for all of everyone on this presentation today is your employees. So having that foundational plan with your employees so they're there to help in the recovery is imperative, I think.
I work for a chain of community newspapers, and over 30 years, we'd asked every conceivable crisis question imaginable, except for this one. What if everybody stopped playing prep sports? Nobody ever asked that question. Fred, take us next.
Yeah, so that's different for everybody, but I would say to you, and there was a question posted in the room, it ties to this a little bit about, how do we come out of this? So, right, you really need to do an after action out of this for your whole company. Where to take it for the future, right? I mean, look at how many different things occurred when we all couldn't go back to our buildings, and who were prepped for that? Not many companies. So you need to look at things, right, that are occurring and come back and do an after action of how we would make that change. Because if we don't learn from what happens today and something else happens, right? So if you change your plan for what occurred today, it's probably going to help on something else. But it's really about looking at what's occurring today, I think, right? Because we don't want to relive it. How would we fix it in the future? So I'm always looking forward, right? So we'll do an after action, and then what are we changing to solve it for the future? And I think that's one of the answers I could give. Some great answers came before it, but how are we going to do that? It's by taking the after action, coming back and actually doing something afterwards. If you just come back to work and never prepare for the next one, you're going to have the same exact problem that may occur.
Excellent. Carlos?
So you mentioned how do we advise companies to be more resilient before something happened? And there's at least two thoughts here. One is around how do we design our businesses and our organizations? For instance, redundancy. So if we have redundancy, imagine a plane, right? Why does a plane have 2 or 3 engines? They can fly with one, but if one fails, we have a backup. There is a similar design principle for organizations, right? Why do we have 2 suppliers? Why do we have 2 factories? So having redundancy is a design element that makes you more resilient. Another element is buffering, and buffering is essentially a way to cushion an impact. Buffers can be inventory. Buffers can be having emergency funds, right? A pile of money that you can use in the case of an emergency. It could be having spare capacity. So in case you need to ramp up production on anything at whatever point in time, you have the ability to do so. So buffers and redundancy, I think, are 2 important design elements that you can implement before something hits us.
Very good. And Dr. Percy?
Yeah, part of it's starting with your risk, because the tendency is always going to be to rebuild what you had because that's what you're familiar with and you know how it works. But for example, I had the privilege of being in a city club citizen research group panel that looked at earthquake preparedness and risk. And one of the things we realized, for example, is that a lot of our petroleum storage is in land that is very unstable, that's landfill area, and would likely could be major damage to those facilities and their access to key energy in doing that. Also very expensive to just say, well, we'll stop there and go somewhere else. But clearly, if you know you're at a risk in a certain facility or an operation or a part of your building and you know it's at risk, if you can't fix it now and you're not able to, you sure don't want, you want to have another plan that when you have to come back quickly after, that you've got an alternative that's going to be much more safer. In this case, building those facilities on land that's much more capable of withstanding damage from an earthquake.
Good information. This has been fantastic. And at this point, I'd like to welcome back Andrew Hone, President and CEO of the PBA. Andrew, you want to take it?
Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciated this conversation. We have a really active Q&A session here to just dive right into. Some of it flanks already discussed topics, but I think each person's asking these in really unique ways. So I think if you don't mind, we will get right into this. And I see our first two questioners here come from PSU. So we have a good, healthy PSU representation on this this call today. So let's start with Jeannie Enders, who's with the PSU School of Business. And she's asking the question, to get to resilience, what needs to change? That is, these tips are so great, everything that people are saying. What are the obstacles that all of you see? And calling out particularly Carlos, what gets in our way of developing this mindset? Right? What is it that we can't get to the point where we wake up and think about this in a very concrete and normalized way? So let's start with that question from Jeannie Enders.
I think that's a really good question. So I think one of the biggest barriers is that if you're great at dealing with risk, if you're really resilient, the consequence of that is that nothing happens. Nothing goes wrong because you're prepared, right? And people start saying, well, why are we wasting all of these resources if nothing ever happens to us, right? So people get into the comfort of saying, oh, we don't need to reinvest. We don't need to rebuild that. We don't need to maintain it or repair it. And eventually something hits us, right? We become too complacent. So I think a barrier is, how do we continue being paranoid about risk even when nothing is happening, right? How do we continue investing into risk and resilience when nothing is happening? And I think that's a really, really difficult kind of mountain to overcome. Another aspect is that there's two very different phases to resilience. One is being able to withstand an impact, right? So imagine a tank. A tank is very robust, right? You can hit it in many different ways and it can continue moving, it can continue operating. The second type of resilience is, once we're hit, how quickly do we respond back? How quickly do we bounce back? And that's very different. That's like a motorbike, right? Being able to change direction very quickly and do things very quickly. And I think organizations struggle to do both, right? How can you be a tank and a motorbike at the same time? That's another really big challenge. And I must admit, I don't have solutions for this, but I think these are the things we need to think about to be better prepared for the future.
Love to hear others' answers to this question as well, if they want to chime in. No particular order.
Well, I would just agree with what Carlos said, and I think that the challenge is particularly for small and medium-sized companies who don't really have staff people that have ever traditionally been assigned to this, or they don't really have as much capacity to have someone looking at this work, which does require not doing the work for once and then you're done. You have to be continuously working on it. And we know that in some major earthquakes that have happened, the small businesses are particularly vulnerable. In some cases, about 75% of small businesses fail during that period because they don't have enough capacity to be resilient and hold on until things get better. So it's a really important imperative, but it is always hard to get people excited about something that might happen or hasn't happened for a while. But Mother Nature is a way of teaching us lately that you can better expect everything.
Bill, and then we'll go to Fred.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Dr. Percy and Carlos. I think it's human nature. No one wants to think about bad stuff, right? So, and I think it's just, you got to have that champion within your business or yourself, and just continue to have that conversation. But it's always, and then when and you do this for a living, right, you're always bringing the bad stuff, right? So it's like, okay, there it comes, you're talking about a bad tragedy again that may or may not happen, and trying to keep that motivation going. But I think it's just imperative to have the conversation. And really the last 6 months to a year, I would say take advantage of what the year's given us, right? It has shown us that things do happen, and capitalize on that, and and just get the momentum for us to plan. And again, I think it's really imperative about the things that we have been facing, and when that earthquake does happen, it's going to take all of us to help each other recover. And if we're all scrambling, it's going to be really hard.
And Andrew, I have to say, and I'll say this, I don't think it's a one size fits all, because everybody's brought up great points, but I'm going to bring up the real point. It's no matter what company it is how much money and time do they want to expend on it? So if it's between a profit category or between creating resilience, they go towards the profit category and say, we'll get to that. And then the next week when they were going to do it, we'll get to that. Or if going out to hire a company because they don't have the trained personnel, we're taking that funding from on something they're working with the company. So it's a mindset that has to be changed and say, if COVID didn't show us anything, you need to create this. You need to create resiliency and have a true plan, because it could cost you more not having that. And that's got to be a mindset that's educated and taught and really brought to business.
It's a great point. The business case for resiliency, right? And what does that mean? And the decisions that we all have to make, the economic decisions. So way to call that out. And I want to move on to this next question, actually really interesting one, really big perspective here from Mark Wubbold. As the current crisis, I guess pick one, but the current crisis that we're in winds down, we are faced with the need to clean up after the crisis. Can your panelists share their ideas for expediting that dimension of the crisis? And I think it's a point to saying, hey, when something hits, we react, but then there's this entire tail that happens afterwards on any level of crises management. And, how do we keep our nose to the grindstone on that in the business community? Let's go reverse order. Fred, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So I have to say, and I kind of mentioned before, an after action plan, because everybody's still going to want to go back to work, or we're getting them in. And then it comes to business continuity and the funding, but you need to really sit down and take everything that your company was affected by, and I'll just use COVID because it's the biggest subject today, by COVID. Where do we lose? What couldn't we do? What business do we lose doing there? And how are we going to make sure that if this occurs again, because if you prepare for this, it'll work for a fire, a hurricane, a storm, all these things all mean the business has to shut down, work remotely, or change. But it's spending time and coming back and doing the after action. If you're in emergency services, we come back from, major emergency or a hurricane, whether you're an emergency manager, fire, we come back and do an after action to say, how can we do it better? How can we fix it? I don't think business and industry, they just want to get their people back and build and get the business rolling. And again, that's another thing that just rolls down the road that doesn't really get taken care of.
Bill, let's head to you on that next.
Yeah, I agree with Fred. I mean, there's this whole demobilization component to it. And so when we were in an event, we always, you're ramping up and you have a demo plan as well. So how do you get all the resources back to where they need to go and wind down? But I think there's another component here that is, it's an emotional component. So depending on that crisis, I mean, your employees may need emotional support and emotional service of support. In our company, we're fortunate enough to have an employee assistance program. And so we bring that up, and when you're in the height of the moment, we're all on that adrenaline. But when you're winding down, and depending what that crisis may have been, it may trigger some memories for many of us that we got to deal with. And I would say just keep that component fresh as well. We're not just machines, but we have an emotional side to us, and we got to nurture that as well.
We'll dive in that in the next question too, but let's get to Dr. Percy and Carlos if you have any add-ons to what was just said.
Well, I appreciate what Bill said. I think one of the things that we found is this whole pandemic has been exhausting to people, and just keeping going their teaching or their support work or their staff or university responsibilities, often taking care of a loved one who may be either at risk or suffering from a health issue, to educating your children in your home, trying to manage your life, uncertainties about what food's available, so many different things that we've tried to do a lot of things that were sort of supportive of our employees. One, just recognizing what they've been through. And we've changed some of our working expectations. We've extended vacation leave time. We've added extra vacation time. We've done a variety of other things in our HR policies, trying to be more flexible and more supportive at this very difficult time, because having your employees healthful is a very important part of coming back. And it can be a pretty lonely experience when you have something as long and drawn out. So I agree with the idea, invest in your employees. And when the time is right, ask them for ideas about how it could be done better. We're trying to learn here a lot about, we went to all remote. What was good about that? What was bad about it? What we should continue? What shouldn't we continue? Who learned well under remote learning? Who didn't learn well? So I think there's a lot of learning for your employees after they have a chance to kind of catch their breath.
I want to dovetail on that. I think I'm a glass full kind of person. I think there's a lot of opportunities coming for us. I see it in my own teaching. I don't particularly like teaching my students online, but I try to make the best out of the situation. And there are certain things that I developed now that I'm sure I'm going to continue using even if I go back, or when I go back to the classroom. So there are small opportunities to learn in a broader scale. I think there are tons of opportunities to learn. All of the experiment of working from home. We can all see the benefits of some aspects of working from home. How are we going to build on that for the future? So I think taking this as an opportunity to learn and to develop is really the silver lining of the pandemic.
This is a great follow-up question. It was really diving in, and I actually want to go explore it a little bit more from Alex Kampf at the Energy Trust of Oregon. Planning, as we've just talked about, can be stressful, it's worrisome. Can you share ways to address the intense planning responsibly and sustainably in regard to the planner's mental health? So let's talk about practitioners, right? So Dr. Percy, let's put this straight to you, right? Because we have a new certificate program. You know, one of my employees signed up to be part of that. You know, how do you help those individuals who have to think, as we've just said, have to have that somewhat crisis mentality? How do you focus on their mental health and best practices to support them working through what are obviously not happy subject matters on a regular basis?
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a fantastic question. I always worry that somebody who's new to a conversation like this might just be overwhelmed and say, oh my God, not only are the threats or risks big, but so are the number of things I'd have to plan for, get ready for, and figure out and do all that. So first of all, I would say, take a deep breath and let yourself work your way into it so that you don't have to take it on. You don't have to have a perfect response, and you can begin that conversation and work through it. I think once you get into it a little bit, the idea that, gee, you know, if we do some good thinking now, people will be healthier, people will be better, their company has a better chance of doing well or surviving or coming back quickly, so that there is an end goal that should the crisis hit and you're able to respond, that you'll be awfully glad you did that, because things will get better and be a much better outcome than you otherwise would have. And again, there are a lot of tools out there that people can use as starting places, so you're not overwhelmed by just trying to think all that through. There are checklists you can start with. There are centered questions you can start with. You don't have to have the whole perfect plan all at once. And I'd also suggest that different groups of professionals have different conversations about this. So your own professional group, whatever that is, whether you're a planner by trade, or whether you're a risk management person, or you're doing project management, that I bet there are discussions within your particular professional associations in which you could have some people with a similar background and perspective be able to be helpful.
Let's go to Carlos, then Bill, then Fred.
Sorry, press the wrong button. So I think the one thing that comes to mind is, how do we tackle the issue of mental health in the workplace? So it's not only the planning, is, you know, I've seen it with colleagues, I've seen it with students, I've seen it in my own family. People are suffering from mental health, and I think we need to take it seriously. If we tackle it seriously, then you will have a workforce that is more ready and more resilient. So is this focus on how do we tackle mental health issues? It's not my research area, but I recognize it's a very important issue we need to tackle.
So as I think about the question, and I think it's like, okay, as the practitioner, how do I stabilize or, help the practitioner get through this? And I think it's for me, it's really, perfection versus good. Right. And so I think if you're going after perfection, that could maybe drive you a little crazy after a while, right? But I think it's really having a good plan. And then if it's like a sports analogy, right? I think every coach or GM who's managing a team has a great plan, right? They know all the things they're going to do this season, and then they have injuries, or their opponent actually does a different play than what they anticipated. You have to be willing to adjust. And even though you have all that planning going in, it's that just be flexible, realize that you need to be flexible, and realize that it's okay to be flexible. And I think all the things we're facing in our society and all the different challenges we've had, people have had to be flexible. And so I think good planners and people that take this on for a living realize that, and they build that flexibility into their thinking. And by doing that, it relieves a lot of pressure, because perfection is really hard, and it could get in the way of having a really good product.
So I agree with what everybody's gone. So let's break it down a little bit different way, right? So first off, it should be built by a team so that the load is spread across, right? Because one person doing this is trying to think of 5 different ways to do it. You're better off having a team that can, collaborate and work on this. And the next phase is, this may be a business or a company that doesn't have a planner that knows how to do it, doesn't have the other person knows how to do it. You might need to hire somebody to come in to work with that team that can bring them in the direction to level set them so that they're not off in a direction that they're all can't agree on, but bring a planner in to work with the team from the company to establish this. And I know, again, and I bring it up, but it's the bottom line all the time of spending money to get to where, but the money you spend today will, I keep saying this, will benefit you in the future, whether it's in government and private sector, but it's planning, using a team. And then if you don't have everybody educated in planning, bring somebody in to assist.
I want to build on this a little bit, Fred, with this next question. So I just remember something really distinctly you said earlier about businesses making choices about where they're allocating their resources. And boy, Susan Romansky, you really nailed an important conversation here that we need to be talking about. And we've learned a lot from the pandemic, right? Some of our larger businesses, of course, were hit hard, but had the infrastructure, the national presence to be able to be a little bit more resilient in their nature, their flexibility. But for the small business, for the person who's the CEO, the bookkeeper, the front store operator, the cleanup, the everything, we really have to talk about this part of our economy in a big way, because the capacity issues that we talked about are there. So I want to go into Susan's question because I really appreciate it. I think for most small businesses, it may be helpful to distinguish between emergency response plans and business continuity plans. I feel like it's important to stress first figuring out how to keep these essential functions going. And then there is what companies may support with response efforts. And I guess my question to build on that to all of you is, what is a small business to do? What is maybe the one thing you would recommend that a small business, a mom and pop, a brick and mortar, a sole entrepreneur can do to be crisis resiliency oriented and prepared? So let's start off with you, Fred.
So yeah, and unfortunately, I think that is the hardest issue with small business, and that's why they were affected across this country at the largest way. So emergency planning is is totally different. Business continuity is, how do you keep running after the emergency happened or planning for, and then there's the emergency, whether it's a fire or the store blew up or somebody broke my window during the night or pandemic came, right? So those are all things to be put on the table. So some of those ways you work is you can actually remember, reach out to your local emergency management, reach out to your fire prevention bureau in your municipality. Fire prevention will come out and help you even create some planning for that. And if it's for a fire escape plan, you could create that to be for other things, but you need to reach out. You're not going to be able to do that as a person. They're not going to have the money to hire a company. So use the government resources. Call your municipal emergency management agency, have a discussion. Call your fire prevention bureau that comes out for free and helps assist you. So it's not as great as when you have the staffing, but at least there are some resources. If you want to proactively reach to, I think you can create something to cover you a little bit on business continuity, and that does tie into emergency operations. So it's the most difficult discussion is small business. So Andrews, that's probably the best answer I could give them at this point.
Let's go back through Bill, then Dr. Percy, and Carlos.
It's a really good question. And I'm trying, I happen to, for a completely different company that's in a different situation altogether. But as a small business, I think what I would think about is like a rainy day fund, right? So if there's like the one thing, the question is like, what's the one thing I need to have, right? I would say, okay, do I have my rainy day fund? Do I have access to that if I need to pull from it? I think the other thing that I want to do, and I think the same thing we do in my home, is like, okay, where are all my important contact information, right? Is it just in my phone or is it written down? Like, I have to admit, I don't even know my wife's phone number. I just push the button and it's there, right? I don't dial in anymore, right? And I always have to ask, like, what's your phone number? But those are the type of things, and it's technology is taking away some of my my rainy day fund in my head, right? Because I don't have those emergency numbers anymore. But I think, to me, that's what I would do. I think I would just, hey, your rainy day fund, and then where are my important documents, my important contacts, knowing exactly where that is. If those are the foundational things, that's all I could do. I think that's what I would do.
Andrew, I've been thinking about this a lot because I think it's the smaller the organization, the more difficult. And I wonder if there's not a role for business organizations like PBA to think about. So let me give you an example. When the CDC announced that you should be wearing masks, we didn't have enough for all of our essential employees who were working in person on campus at Portland State. And we tried to call around. It was very hard. It was going to be 2 or 3 weeks. But I happened to notice that my local dry cleaner went into the mask production business, made them pretty reasonably. And so I went in to my friend there and said, I need 1,500 masks. And I need them in 3 days. And he did that. And he was able to bring back his full staff for 2 or 3 just to make that order. I think a lot of people want to support local restaurants. They want to support local businesses. I think there were a lot of informal things people did. I saw GoFundMe campaigns for businesses to support them. And so I think that people in our community wanted to help small business. They care about them. But the way, if you can link up consumers and products and availability of products, how do you go to a restaurant? How that's who's available? Some way of those organizations working together to be able to signal what they have to offer, particularly in the context of this situation, to align that with many people who I think do care about our local businesses and want to be connected. Just something I was thinking about.
Great feedback.
I think that the one great advantage that SMEs have over larger organizations is that they're more nimble. They have a smaller hierarchy. People can make decisions. People can make a move very quickly and change their business, right? Start producing masks, or start delivering home, right? If you have a restaurant, or set up on the street. We've seen a lot of businesses here in the Portland area very quickly trying to respond, trying to find ways of doing things differently in order to recover, or at least partly recover from the pandemic. I also like to emphasize the point of seeking help. I think Fred talked about seeking help from government, and Dr. Percy talked about seeking help from the community. I think we've seen good examples of those, but you need to go and do it, and you need to be able to do it. It reminds me of some research we did a few years ago. Smaller companies generally don't know how to apply for funding from FEMA or any of these government organizations. They just don't have the bandwidth and the capability to do it. And I think a little bit of learning on how do I seek for help is important for small businesses.
These are great tips for everyone here. And I want to turn it to Dana, who I know has our wrap question here. So it's over to you.
We as humans react better to disasters than we do to good times. And what I mean by that is, in 2008, we had a flu. It came out of Mexico, I believe. I think it was H1N1. And when it hit, the American public health agencies were so dexterous and so deft, and they got on it so fast, it ended up not being a crisis. And the next thing we heard from people was, oh, they were crying wolf. I mean, the sky was falling. It ended up being no big deal whatsoever. What is the communication plan in good times Not before a crisis, in a crisis, after a crisis. What is the communication mechanism in good times that can convince businesses the sky is going to fall and there is a wolf? And Carlos, you want to kick us off?
I think that's a really difficult thing to do because the media is so obsessed with things that attract our attention that we're constantly being scared by all sorts of different things, right? So when a real one comes, we think it's just another one, right? They're trying to scare us again about something that is not as hard or not as bad as we thought. Something that really surprised me during this pandemic is that Asian countries seem to be better prepared. I mean, if you look at the impact throughout, China, Southeast Asia, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, they seem, and Australia and New Zealand too, they seem to have been more prepared for this. But I don't know if you noticed, even before the pandemic, you would go to airports and you would see people of Asian origin actually wearing masks even before. They were ready, the communication had been more effective. They probably have faced it closer. Right? Some of the previous pandemics affected Asia much more than Europe or the Americas. So I think there's a little bit of us being able to learn from others, right? From the experience of others. And maybe try to be a little less alarmist about some of the things that don't warrant such a big splash, right?
Good return served back on the media. Thank you. Dr. Percy, what do you think?
I think we're at a really unique moment here. I think that, I know the Cascadia subduction zone, that's been talked about for a long time, and it may happen now, may happen in 100 years, so do you want to pay attention? I think the experience of the last year or two, if you think everybody's just suffered from the pandemic, wildfires have been very common in many places, and we've seen the devastation. We've seen pictures of the devastation. We've seen huge flooding examples after major storms. We've seen the devastation. Look at the ice storm. Look at the energy grid in Texas and how people froze to death in Texas and how the damage. And so I think maybe this is getting connected to global warming issues, which has its own political overtones to it. But I think people have lived and seen enough reality of crisis and major harmful impact in their own community, states, and regions that I think we're at a better time to say, something's going to hit, we better be ready. So we don't have to just sort of think about one thing like maybe an earthquake, but we've just seen things hit and we need to be ready.
Fred, your company or your agency was in Texas during the freeze. And I remind that the power that went out this year also went out in Texas in 2011, the last time there was a freeze.
Correct. And I'm glad, Dr. Percy, because I was going to talk about Texas very largely. So, for example, Texas is the only one not on the national grid. There's no redundancy to that grid, right? Redundancy must exist. Number two is because they were not under the national grid, they were told they should comply with federal regulations on preparedness, but they also did not. So one of the examples is they ordered all the fuel, and on our company or any vendor there had to use low sulfur fuel. Well, it's not temperature resistant. All of the automatic generators that were set to start didn't start because the fuel gelled. And then, things occurred and that caused a ramification. Once that occurred, everything occurred, right? Cell, generators, power plants. There are still power plants offline because the huge generators that would come on back up down there didn't have heat blankets, right? Diesels don't like cold. So it is about preparedness and thinking about anything can happen. And the federal government had written a thing up after 2011 of recommendations, but because they're their own grid, they didn't have to comply with it and no actions were taken. So I think that's a great story here to say, take action before, after, and remedial, remedial, and then your after action to learn from it, because that has to be done. So what we've done is we violated Texas law. All our fuel has been changed, and we started trucking fuel in from further away, so we could change the fuel out in our generators. And all of ours has been changed now to that, technically in violation, but we need to be prepared for the future. And those are action items. So I hope that closed up some of the action items we're going to be speaking about, but that is truly action items not followed came to fruition where they actually happened again and worse.
Bill, do you want to have the final word on that one?
Sure. For us, we're part of a regional grid. So, we're definitely different than Texas. And, you know, we have our OPUC, or Oregon Public Utilities Commission, that helps regulate that and make sure we do have that resiliency. So I think we're clearly in much better shape in that sense. But I believe your question really was more related to, I mean, how do we keep this conversation going? And I think a forum like this is excellent, right? But you know, let's face it, you know, with distance and time, memories fade. And we have to keep this, we have to keep forums like this going. I'd be a suggestion, this may be an annual forum that we just keep doing and saying, okay, hey, what did we learn from this last year? And what can we share with our community again this year? And I agree with Carlos. I mean, crying wolf, and you know, no one wants to hear that. No one wants to hear bad stories all the time, right? We want to be happy, right? So, but I think this forum is excellent, and my suggestion was that we would keep this as an annual event and bring in other speakers to bring in another spin to it, because I think we can all learn from each other. And clearly in this space, no one knows all the answers. And again, as a community, we are much, much better.
Thank you. Andrew?
It's a great way to take it home. I see there's a lot of still unanswered questions here in the Q&A function. My team has made sure to copy all of these down. I really want to acknowledge the thoughtfulness of everything that's been coming in here for the Q&A. I appreciate, David, your questions around structural inequity and race. Susan with Frog Ferry, really getting into the smart aspects of how do we transport workforces or first responders in the event of catastrophe. And then I see an unknown Morgan over at Covenant Technologies about how do we modernize all this sort of approach here from a technology standpoint. So all these questions we'll follow up with our panelists afterwards and make sure you get some responses so we can keep this dialogue going. I thought it was an excellent way, Bill, to end the note on this should be an annual thing. You cannot be persistent enough in this conversation. A tip of the hat to Fred, who I know comes from Jersey, and I know shared an experience that I had, which was with Superstorm Sandy, which completely changed the way that people in the Northeast thought about how to be prepared and resilient in the face of crisis. And there's just no question, there's no end to the possibilities of being prepared. I think we have to really be thoughtful about this, and knowing that we have been resilient over this past year, and every one of our businesses in this region have truly demonstrated the ability to adapt in the face of innumerable crises. So compliments to all the employers who are on this call today. And then to our panelists, I just want to say thank you for being in the fields that you're in, and for being analytical and thoughtful of your approach to make sure that we are not just prepared for what was, but what will be. And I think it's a point in time that is worthy of the call out, that we cannot let the events of this past year just fade away. So let us not let that happen. With that, I also want to thank our moderator, Dana Haynes, of course, from Pamplin, and for their sponsorship. Really appreciate your support to Michelle Weisenbach and KeyBank, to my team as well. I encourage all of you to join us on April 21st for our next panel discussion on the state of downtown Portland, worthy of another conversation deep dive. So let's dig into that. And with that, I want to thank everybody. Wish you all a happy St. Patrick's Day. Please stay safe, be well, and take care, everyone.